It was a chilly Monday morning at Jefferson High, a school whose towering brick walls and echoing corridors left little room for individuality. In one of those long, sterile hallways, 16-year-old Aaliyah Johnson stepped through the revolving glass doors. With a fuller figure and naturally curly shoulder-length hair perfectly framing her face, she wore a worn gray hoodie and carried a tan backpack that had seen better days. Every step she took, heavy with the weight of isolation, was a silent testament to years of being ignored. Aaliyah had always been an unnoticed presence in a sea of more popular faces. Throughout her school life, she endured the quiet cruelty of whispered remarks and sidelong glances as if her existence were an inconvenient truth. Today, as the fluorescent lights flickered overhead and the rows of metal lockers bore witness to the daily ritual, she walked with a mixture of determination and timidity. Clutching the straps of her backpack tightly, she headed down the corridor, fully aware of every dismissive smile and every subtle gesture aimed to make her feel less than. In that moment, every unkind look, every mocking gesture, resonated within her like a low, constant hum. The popular cliques congregated in clusters, and as she passed, two white girls exchanged exaggerated expressions. One even gestured with a raised finger, while a white teenage boy, dressed in a varsity jacket, smirked imperiously. The hallways seemed to vibrate with unspoken judgment. Yet, beneath it all, a spark of defiance began to kindle in Aaliyah's heart, a silent promise that one day, her story would not be defined solely by the cruelties she endured. Later that morning, inside a cramped classroom where the teacher's monotony blended with the rustle of papers and occasional laughter from groups of students in front, Aaliyah found herself forced into a seat in the far back. Surrounded by lively chatter and dismissive stares, she huddled with her battered notebook, meticulously recording lessons even as her thoughts spiraled into quiet rebellion. Every scribble on those pages was a secret oath to herself, a determination to reclaim her worth despite the world's cruelty. When the final bell rang, the cacophony of voices and laughter slowly subsided into the muted clatter of empty corridors. Aaliyah lingered by her locker for a few long minutes, gathering her belongings as if each movement were a small act of resistance. In the lonely aftermath of the day's relentless dismissals, she retreated to the solitude of her bedroom. Under the dim light of a single lamp, she opened her journal, a companion that had witnessed every silent tear and every beaten-down sigh. With trembling hands, she began to write, not just about the wounds of the day but about the seeds of a quiet revolution that had just begun to take root deep within her soul. That night, as the city outside slumbered, Aaliyah lay awake with her thoughts echoing like footsteps in an empty hall. The memory of pointed gestures and hushed snickers mingled with the soft promise of an inner strength that had been kindled within the darkness. In this vulnerable solitude, she vowed that the pain inflicted upon her would not define her. Instead, it would become the fuel for a transformation, a relentless drive that would, one day, make her voice unignorable. In the coming days, the weight of her daily torment slowly began to shift. Every sidelong glance and every whispered word of mockery now carried a dual edge, a reminder of her past and a challenge to forge a different future. As the week progressed, subtle acts of kindness, once nearly imperceptible, began to surface. A passing smile from a once indifferent teacher, a hesitant nod from a classmate, even a gentle word whispered in the hall. The first tentative signs that the oppressive walls of Jefferson High might finally be crumbling. The transformation was not instantaneous. It was a delicate alchemy of pain and hope, a slow, burning ember amid a barrage of indifference. Yet, with each passing day, Aaliyah's silent resolve grew stronger. By the time the week ended, even the most hardened voices had softened, if only imperceptibly. An anonymous note arrived on her phone, "Your work matters. Don't let them define your worth." In that moment, as she read the message over and over, she began to see that perhaps she was not as invisible as she'd once believed. The quiet support, though small, ignited in her the courage to keep moving forward. Every step in those familiar, echoing corridors became a step toward reclaiming her identity, a gradual rise from the depths of isolation to the beginnings of self-empowerment. In her journal, the narrative of relentless dismissals began to merge with a new chapter of resilience. The pain of past insults, which had once felt overwhelming, was now slowly transmuted into a quiet determination to prove that her voice, though soft, was powerful enough to alter the course of her life. Over the subsequent days, the corridors of Jefferson High began to reveal a subtle yet undeniable transformation. The very walls that once echoed with whispered ridicule now carried faint hints of empathy and curiosity. In the midst of the noisy clatter of everyday school life, every small gesture, the gentle nod from a teacher, the barely perceptible smile exchanged between previously indifferent students, served as a quiet affirmation that something within the institution was beginning to change. Aaliyah, though still burdened by the memory of that painful morning, found herself sensing an emerging shift in the behavior of those around her. In every class, as she settled into her habitual seat at the back, she noticed that the once dismissive glances had softened into expressions of tentative regard. During a history lecture that droned on about the struggles of unsung heroes, a classmate, a usually reserved student, finally raised his hand and posed a question that resonated with an unspoken challenge to the status quo. His voice, though soft, carried a truth that seemed to momentarily pull the classroom into a reflective silence. Outside, in the noisy cafeteria where the clamor of lunchtime banter had always drowned out individual stories, there emerged small clusters of conversation that hinted at change. Aaliyah, who often sat alone at a corner table, observed that a few groups began to include her with quiet gestures. A friendly nod here, an offering of a seat there. These actions, modest and easily overlooked, gradually stitched together the fabric of a more inclusive environment. It was as though the sheer force of her silent endurance had started to shift the collective consciousness of her peers. Even the teachers began to take notice. Mr. Daniels, who had long been known for his strict yet indifferent manner, paused during a geometry lesson to compliment a student's question, a moment that, while directed at someone else, seemed to indicate a broader awareness. In the teacher's lounge, hushed discussions took on a more reflective tone. Some educators wondered, quietly and with much thought, if the rigid methods of the past had cost the school more than they had ever realized. Though no one spoke loudly of change, the seeds of a more compassionate approach were slowly being sown. At home, Aaliyah's nights became filled with long hours of introspection. Sitting at her small desk beneath the soft glow of a lamp, she poured her thoughts into the pages of her journal. Each entry was a careful act of defiance, a recognition that her experiences, however painful, were also the forge in which her inner strength was being honed. She wrote about the slight yet meaningful shifts, the compassionate look from a classmate, the gentle acknowledgement of a caring teacher, the subtle, almost imperceptible change in the tone of the taunts. Through her writing, the sharp sting of each hurtful moment gradually transformed into a reservoir of quiet determination. In the midst of this internal awakening, the administrative wheels at Jefferson High slowly began to turn. Anonymous surveys, once a distant concept, started trickling into conversations between teachers and the principal. Behind closed doors, a few educators raised concerns about the long-standing practices that allowed indifference to fester unchecked. While nothing immediate or dramatic was announced, there were murmurs of policy reviews and discussions about fostering a more respectful environment for every student. These meetings, shrouded in confidentiality, provided the first hints that even the highest echelons of school management were finally beginning to listen. One crisp afternoon in early winter, as pale sunlight filtered through frost-tinted windows, Aaliyah witnessed a small yet significant incident. During a particularly long lunch break, when the buzz of the cafeteria was at its peak, a student who had been part of the popular crowd approached her table. In a rare moment of apparent sincerity, he said simply, "I'm sorry," and turned away without waiting for a response. That single, almost inaudible apology, though lacking grand gestures, reverberated through her heart. It was as if the entire weight of the past few months had momentarily lifted, replaced by the promise that even the harshest attitudes could, in time, be softened by genuine remorse. Day by day, the environment around Aaliyah evolved with the cautious optimism of those who had, for so long, taken their normalcy for granted. In classrooms, the collective energy shifted imperceptibly, as if the air itself had grown lighter. During a routine science lab, a group of students, normally dismissive, began to exchange words that hinted at mutual respect. In the hallways, the cold laughter that once echoed with cruelty now seemed subdued, replaced by quiet, reflective murmurs. Each small act contributed to a burgeoning sense of community, a gradual realization that true strength lies in compassion, not in empty mockery. For Aaliyah, this slow but steady transformation fueled an inner resurgence. Her journal, once a repository of silent anguish, now brimmed with sketches of new dreams and detailed plans for personal growth. She started to see her struggle not as a mark of defeat, but as a necessary crucible that was forging within her the courage to rise. Every challenging moment was recast in her mind as a building block for a future where her voice would matter. A future where her quiet resilience would become a beacon for others who had long suffered in silence. In a particularly poignant instance, during a family dinner that evening, her older sister remarked, "Sometimes I wonder how you keep going, Aaliyah, but seeing how strong you are, quietly, without making a fuss, it makes me believe in tomorrow." Those words, spoken with sincere warmth, solidified in Aaliyah the growing conviction that her perseverance was not only breaking her own chains, but was also inspiring change in subtle ways around her. As the weeks rolled by, even the rigid figures of authority began to adjust their stances. The principal, whose once implacable demeanor softened over countless quiet meetings, began to personally inquire about the well-being of students who had long been relegated to the background. In hushed corridors during early mornings or just before school ended, teachers were overheard saying things like, "Maybe we need to listen a little more," or "Every student deserves to be seen." These murmurs, though small individually, converged into a growing chorus of acknowledgement, a reaffirmation that the old culture of isolation was finally on the brink of change. And so, the slow revolution at Jefferson High gained momentum, sowing seeds that would eventually transform the very core of the institution. Aaliyah's once overlooked struggles, once echoing through cold corridors, now became the catalyst for a broader awakening among both students and teachers. The silent courage of one girl had begun to challenge an entire system, a truth that was beginning to be whispered in every classroom and every hallway. As the final weeks of the school year unfolded, the transformation at Jefferson High reached a tipping point. The corridors that had once resounded solely with indifference now vibrated with something unmistakably different. A quiet, resolute energy that seemed to pulse beneath every whispered conversation and every tentative glance. In every corner of the school, old habits were challenged, and the seeds of empathy that had been sown in the shadow of cruelty were beginning to take root. During one afternoon class that had once been marred by boredom and whispered sneers, a sudden moment of clarity broke through the mundane routine. In a history lesson recalling the struggles and triumphs of unsung heroes, an unexpectedly brave student posed a question that resonated with the unvoiced struggles of so many. The teacher paused, and for a few heartbeats, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. That small yet potent break in the established order struck a chord not only with the speaker but with the entire class, reminding everyone that even in the silence, the power of an honest voice could disrupt the status quo. Aaliyah, who had hitherto endured countless hours of cold neglect, began to notice subtle changes in the people around her. In the bustling cafeteria where groups of friends had once laughed without a care, she observed that a few students now exchanged glances filled with empathy instead of derision. The familiar cliques seemed to be reconfiguring themselves. Those who had been complicit in the old ways now appeared to question whether their behavior was right. In hushed whispers, conversations emerged about fairness, about the importance of respecting every individual even if they seemed different. In the classroom, the transformation was equally palpable. A teacher, known for his strict adherence to routine, quietly acknowledged the brilliance of a student's question, something that had gone unnoticed before. That brief moment of recognition, as fleeting as it was, sent ripples through the ranks, hinting at a slowly changing culture where even the quietest voices could matter. For Aaliyah, these small gestures were monumental. Each time she caught a fleeting smile from a classmate or a subtle nod from a teacher, it reaffirmed an emerging truth, that her silent endurance had begun to erode the walls of apathy around her. At home, every evening became a ritual of reflection. In the solitude of her dimly lit room, Aaliyah would sit at her desk and pour her thoughts into her journal. The pages that had once been filled only with the sting of neglect were now infused with sketches of hope and plans for a better future. In the quiet sanctuary of those late hours, she allowed herself to see that every dismissive glance and every whispered insult had contributed to a growing determination. A quiet revolution that was as much about reclaiming her own voice as it was about inspiring change in those around her. The transformation extended beyond the individual level. Even the school's administration began to perceive a shift in the collective mood. Behind closed doors, discussions that had previously been dominated by conventional metrics and standardized policies slowly turned toward the welfare of the students. Anonymous surveys and confidential meetings, once considered a bureaucratic formality, started to yield genuine insights into the emotional climate of the school. Although no sweeping reforms were immediately announced, the mere acknowledgement that change was necessary ignited a cautious optimism among both staff and students. One brisk afternoon, as icy winds rattled the windows of Jefferson High, a pivotal moment crystallized this wave of change. During a routine school assembly, an event that had long been marked by perfunctory speeches and obligatory applause, the principal took an unexpected pause. In a measured tone, he spoke not of academic achievements or sports victories, but of the deeper values that underpinned the school's existence. His words, imbued with genuine concern for every student's well-being, resonated powerfully throughout the packed auditorium. He remarked, "Every challenge we face is an opportunity to redefine who we are. Let us remember that every silent struggle hides a strength waiting to be awakened." In that moment, the collective gaze of the student body shifted. The assembly, filled with eyes that had once flickered indifferently, now shone with a quiet recognition of shared humanity. For Aaliyah, that assembly was transformative. Standing among her peers, she felt the weight of her experiences lift, replaced by a burgeoning sense of purpose. The very act of listening, of being acknowledged by someone in authority who genuinely cared, instilled in her a newfound determination. She realized that her journey was far from over. Rather, it was entering a phase where every small act of courage was a stepping stone to broader change. The hurtful memories that had once defined her were merging with the tender notes of hope, creating an intricate mosaic of resilience that spoke of both the pain of the past and the promise of a brighter future. In the days that followed, whispers of transformation permeated every aspect of the school. Students began to gather in small groups, not to share inane gossip, but to discuss ideas of inclusion, fairness, and mutual respect. These discussions, initially timid and hushed, gradually grew into more confident dialogues that challenged the long-standing norms of exclusion. Aaliyah, though still reserved, found herself increasingly drawn into these conversations not as a victim but as a quiet advocate whose silence had become a powerful instrument for change. Even in the more rigid environments of the classroom and the cafeteria, the air was different. Teachers, too, appeared more attentive. In one memorable instance during a literature class, a teacher paused mid-lecture to ask if anyone had ever felt truly unheard, a question that reverberated meaningfully among the students. The impact was subtle, yet it signaled that the once unyielding barriers of indifference were beginning to crumble under the sheer force of empathy. Aaliyah's personal evolution continued to unfold in parallel. Every day, as she navigated the familiar hallways with her head held a little higher, she felt a deep internal shift, a quiet realization that she was no longer defined solely by the mockery she had endured. Instead, her inner strength, nurtured in the solitude of her late nights and the whispered affirmations of newfound allies, was blossoming. It was as if the pain she had once shouldered became the very foundation of her emerging voice, a voice that, though soft, promised to resonate powerfully when the time was right. Then, on a particularly crisp day when the winter chill began to give way to the promise of spring, the transformation reached a turning point. In a classroom where the ordinary had once reigned, a subtle but poignant moment occurred. A student, once part of the indifferent majority, hesitated and then offered a sincere word of acknowledgement to Aaliyah. It was a brief, almost imperceptible gesture, but for her it symbolized a crack in the wall of indifference that had long confined her. With that single act, it became evident that the quiet revolution was no longer confined to her solitary struggles. It was starting to ripple outward, touching the hearts of those who had once remained complacent in their cruelty. That day, as Aaliyah walked home under a sky streaked with the soft colors of dusk, she felt an unfamiliar lightness in her steps. The echoes of past insults and dismissive glances still lingered, but now they were accompanied by a budding sense of hope, a belief that her silent endurance was not in vain, that her story could indeed spark change. In that twilight, every step became a quiet declaration of self-worth, every breath a reaffirmation that she was ready to embrace a future defined not by the pain of yesterday but by the promise of tomorrow. In the final days of the school year, the walls of Jefferson High took on a new resonance. The once frosty corridors, haunted by the echoes of ridicule, now vibrated with a gentle warmth, a quiet revolution that began with Aaliyah's steadfast resilience and had slowly permeated every corner of the school. The murmurs of negativity had faded into a background hum, replaced by conversations about fairness, respect, and the dignity that every student deserved. On the day of the final assembly, the auditorium was filled with an air of solemn promise. There were no grandiose speeches or explosive declarations. Instead, there was a thoughtful silence, a collective pause that acknowledged the journey of change. As the principal stepped on stage, his voice was measured and sincere. He spoke of the struggles that many students had endured, not as isolated incidents, but as symptoms of a system that was long overdue for transformation. His words, simple yet laden with meaning, resonated in every seat of the crowded hall. Aaliyah, who had once moved through the halls as an invisible shadow, now sat among her peers with her head held high. Her eyes, once downcast in quiet torment, now shone with a confident clarity. Her journey from isolation to self-empowerment was visible in every line of her face, a living testament to the fact that true strength is born in the quiet moments of endurance. When the principal's closing words, reminders of unity and shared humanity, fell silent, the entire room seemed to exhale as if relieved by the acknowledgement of long-ignored truths. In that defining moment, something remarkable happened. Aaliyah rose slowly from her seat. There was no bluster in her step, no dramatic flourish. Instead, she walked to the center of the stage with a measured grace that demanded attention. As she reached the front, the room fell into an anticipatory hush. For the first time in a long while, her voice was not just a silent protest but the carrier of a powerful message. In a soft yet resolute tone, Aaliyah began to speak. She recounted her experiences, not to evoke pity, but to share the strength that had quietly grown from those deep scars. Every word was deliberate, each sentence a tribute to her inner journey. She spoke of the cruelty and indifference that had once threatened to consume her, and of the gradual, almost imperceptible acts of kindness that had finally kindled a spark of hope. She told them that while she had endured the harshness of judgment and exclusion, those experiences had forged in her an unwavering resolve to stand tall and demand respect, not just for herself, but for every student who had ever felt unworthy or unseen. As her measured voice reverberated across the auditorium, the faces before her began to change. What had once been a sea of indifferent expressions was now a reflective audience, each person absorbing the quiet, powerful truth of her words. It was not a rallying cry of loud protest, it was a gentle declaration that genuine courage often lies in the persistent silence of self-respect and determination. Her words, laced with both vulnerability and strength, seemed to touch a chord within everyone present. For a moment, the weight of years spent in isolation transformed into a luminous promise of a kinder, more inclusive future. After she finished, the auditorium held a silence that was both reverent and transformative. Then came the applause, soft at first, then building gradually into a steady, heartfelt ovation. In that applause was the acknowledgement of every life that had been diminished, every spirit that had been sidelined. And in that applause, Aaliyah found not only validation but also a call to continue the journey of change. The impact of that day rippled far beyond the assembly hall. In the weeks and months that followed, Jefferson High evolved. The once rigid social hierarchies began to crumble. Teachers adopted a more empathetic approach, and students, emboldened by the courage of one voice, started to engage in genuine acts of kindness. The entire school environment, which had once been characterized by unyielding indifference, began to reflect a newfound culture of respect and mutual support. Aaliyah's personal transformation did not end with that assembly. At home, she continued to document her thoughts and dreams in her journal, now filled with plans for community initiatives and ideas to help others find their voice. Her journey had become both a personal triumph and a beacon of hope for those who had long struggled in the shadows. Her quiet revolution became a movement, proof that even the softest voice, when nurtured by resilience and unyielding self-worth, could indeed shake the very foundations of an oppressive world. In the end, the story of Aaliyah was not just about overcoming bullying. It was a powerful reminder that true leadership is measured by the quiet strength of one's character, and that the smallest act of perseverance can ignite a profound change in an entire community. Her journey illuminated the possibility that every individual, no matter how overlooked or underestimated, holds within them a boundless capacity for transformation. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others. Your support is important. It helps us grow and bring you more powerful stories every week. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and tell us about a moment when a small act of kindness changed your life. Thanks for watching and have a great day.